So we're ready to begin. We refuse to be enemies. How Muslims and Jews can make peace one friendship at a time is a manifesto by two American citizens, a Muslim woman and a Jewish man concerned with the rise of intolerance and bigotry in our country. Together, Sabiha Rehman and Walter Ruby have spent decades doing interfaith work and nurturing cooperation among communities. They have learned that through face-to-face encounters, people of all backgrounds can come to know the other as a fellow human being and turn her or him into a trusted friend. Walter Ruby has worked as a journalist for more than 30 years in postings around the world covering stories of Jewish interest or related to the Israeli-Palestinian peace process. As a reporter covering the World Congress of Imams and Rabbis for Peace in 2006, Mr. Ruby decided to dedicate himself for the mission of nurturing ties of communication, reconciliation, and cooperation between Jews and Muslims. For 9 years, he worked as Muslim-Jewish Relations Director at the New York-based Foundation for Ethnic Understanding. He has worked to build bonds between synagogues and mosques and Muslim and Jewish organizations. Mr. Ruby presently serves as Executive Director of Jews, Muslims, and Allies Acting Together, a community of interfaith activists in Greater Washington, and as coordinator of Washington area chapter of Project Rosanna, which works to strengthen ties between Israelis and Palestinians through healthcare. Sabiha Rehman is a blogger, public speaker, and author of the acclaimed memoir, Threading My Prayer Rug, One Woman's Journey from Pakistani Muslim to American Muslim. Ms. Rehman migrated from Pakistan to the United States in 1971 after her marriage to her husband Khalid, a Pakistani doctor in New York. Ms. Rehman serves as a board member of the Muslim-Jewish Solidarity Committee. She has given over 250 talks in nearly 100 cities and houses of worship, academic institutions, libraries, and community organizations. Mrs. Rehman holds a master's in healthcare administration and has had a 25-year career as a hospital executive in hospitals in New York, New Jersey, and Saudi Arabia. When her grandson Omar was diagnosed with autism, she devoted herself to serving families affected by autism. She co-founded the National Autism Association New York Metro chapter and served as its president from 2008 to 2011. There will be a question and answer after their presentation. There will be refreshments in the ballroom, and the presenters will be signing their book for those interested. Thank you. Please welcome them.
Well, it's wonderful to be here, everyone. And before we started, I just wanted to introduce two dear friends of mine who have become dear friends of mine in the last couple of months, Zara and Zarema Mustafayeva, who are Crimean Tatars, a very little-known Muslim group that was persecuted by the Russians terribly on a couple of occasions, but after they took over Crimea in 2014, and Zara and Zarema even earlier had to flee to Kiev to build their careers, but so they were living in Kiev for close to 10 years, or more than 10 years actually, close to 15 years. And then early this year, as you know, the invasion came. They had every reason to fear that if the Russians had taken Kiev, they might have been arrested, because they were, I should say they've been doing work as videographers on YouTube. They have their own channel telling the history of the Crimean Tatars. So now they've come to us, and they're hopefully going to be going to Harvard and being able to then take they're going to be doing a program at Harvard for scholars at risk, we hope, and then they'll be able to hopefully build their video channel also in English and really take it to the next level. So I'm just really so happy to see it. This is the first time I've seen them in person, but we've been working, helping them, so they're really... Okay, so I guess the show starts. Yeah.
Shalom, salam. Thank you, George, for that very kind introduction and for inviting us here. Can you hear me? Okay. I grew up in Pakistan. In those years, I had never met a Jewish person. Pakistan was and remains pro-Palestinian. It has not yet recognized Israel. So I grew up viewing all Jews through the lens of the Middle East conflict. In fact, my father's passport was stamped all countries of the world except Israel. And that is literally and figuratively where I came from when I came to the United States in 1971. Walter, had you ever met a Muslim?
I had never met a Muslim until well into my, Nessun Lad, okay, sure. I had never met a Muslim until I was well into my 20s, even though, interestingly, when I grew up a somewhat lonely Jewish child in mainly Gentile suburbs of Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, and I was deeply moved by the book Exodus as a child, you know. And then, some of you of a certain age may remember that book, and then lo and behold, do you want me to use this one? How's that?
You have to turn on the red button. At the bottom, there's a red button at the bottom like this one.
Can you hear me? Oh, there it is. Now I think it's on. Oh, good. Okay, so where were we? So yeah, suddenly it was like a good, fairy came, and my father got a position in Israel for a year as a sabbatical year. He was a physicist at the Weizmann Institute of Science in Rehovot, so that I spent that year as a sixth grader in Israel, and that's how I got bonded with Israel my whole life. And you know, it just totally transformed me in terms of my strong identification with the land and as a Jew in a way that I had never felt that Jewish before. So that's really what grabbed me. I didn't go to synagogue as a kid. My parents, for whatever reason, that was not part of their lifestyle. But anyway, so we had that. But the interesting thing, though, is at that time I had no interactions with any Arabs, any Palestinians, or either Christians or Muslims. It just didn't happen. It happened later when I went back as an adult, because I decided that I had to go back as an adult. I felt like I needed to live there, and I would go back at the age of 25 and become a journalist. Long story, but anyway, that was my initial. But I didn't meet any Muslims until that time, when I came back in 1976. Sabia?
So what was it like when we had our first encounter with the other? What changed our perceptions? How did each of us end up getting engaged in interfaith dialogue? We tell these stories in our book, I, a Homemaker, in the 1970s, hanging out with my Orthodox Jewish neighbors by the sidewalk, exchanging notes on halal and kosher. Walter, a journalist, interviewing Palestinians in Israel and connecting personally with Muslims, Jews, and Christians. And then, much later, in the early 2000s, he found himself bringing imams and rabbis together. We take you on our parallel journeys as each of us shifted from being particularistic, celebrating our identities first and foremost, and eventually embracing universalism and celebrating our shared humanity. And then one day, in 2010, our paths crossed. I was in the office working for the American Society for Muslim Advancement when the phone rang. I picked up the phone, and at the other end, this is Walter Ruby. I am the Director of Muslim-Jewish Relations at the Foundation for Ethnic Understanding. And I went, whoa. A Jewish person whose sole responsibility is Muslim-Jewish relations development? Oh my God, I got to meet this person. Neither one of us had any idea where this relationship would take us. So we would run into one another in interfaith spaces. But then in 2016, my memoir, Threading My Prayer Rug, was being published, and it occurred to me that it would be a good idea to get an endorsement from a rabbi, Walter. He is not a rabbi, but he worked for one. So I emailed him. I was in Pakistan visiting family, and I sent him an email saying, Walter, I'm writing this book, and do you think that the rabbi will be willing to write a blurb? And his appropriate response was, I have to read the book. Well, he was the reader and the blurber. Ghost. So I emailed him the manuscript, and this nice Jewish gentleman spent his day of rest on Saturday reading the manuscript, writes back to me, emails, Sabia, the rabbi will be happy to write a blurb. And you know what? I have an idea. Why don't the two of us write a book together? Walter, why the idea of the book?
Well, there's sort of a backstory to what Sabia said. Why was I spending my day of rest reading her book? Because I had kind of promised I'd get it back. I'd read it several weeks earlier, get it back to her by this time, and then I hadn't done it. I'd been procrastinating, doing a million things. And then she said, but I need it by Monday. And I'm like, okay, I'll do it. Of course I'll do it. But I was like, oh, there goes my weekend, you know. And so I sat down sort of grudgingly on Saturday morning and picked it up. And I think I spent the entire Shabbat just swallowing this book. I mean, it was so, so good. And of course, we're here to tell you about our book, but I have to tell you, her book, Threading My Prayer Rug, was just it's a wonderful book. If any of you are interested in looking at that too. It's a great evocation of the immigrant experience in America, having come from Pakistan with her husband Khalid, who's here, and how they had been involved in the upbuilding of the Muslim community in Staten Island and many other things, and many, by the way, many issues that Jews face. For example, she had two teenage sons. How to kind of wanted them to be with Muslim girls, and how do you do that, and how do you do that without pushing them away, and all that kind of stuff. So it was a great book. It's very funny, it's very frank, it's very beautiful. Anyway, I loved her book, so that was number one. So then I said, you know what? I've been looking for some time now for a Muslim co-author, because I had been involved in something at the Foundation for Ethnic Understanding as the Muslim-Jewish program director, and so I've been doing that work for, by that time, close to 10 years. And I thought we'd been very successful. Not only myself, but many other people who were involved in had gotten involved in Muslim-Jewish relations. About the same time I got into it, 06, 07, we'd really built something important on, wonderful Muslims and Jews together. But the problem is, of course, nobody knew about it. Nobody knows it. Nobody knew, nobody knows, that problem. The media doesn't cover us to the extent I would like, even though I'm a former reporter, but maybe we're too good news, that whole syndrome. So anyway, I wanted to write a book. I'd wanted to write a book for some years because I thought, we got to get this message out. We got to tell people this is happening. But then by the time that we actually did meet and decide to write the book together, it was a somewhat different situation. It was 2016, 2017, and we all know what was happening in America at that time. And both Sabia and I were very concerned about where America was going. And so I sort of felt, so when we met, when we sat down together, I said, Sabia, I think we need to write a book in the aftermath of the 2016 election that could serve as a manifesto of why Muslim-Jewish alliance is so needed at this moment in history when both communities feel threatened by the rise of bigotry and authoritarianism. And as the two largest religious minority communities in America, we must stand together in support of democracy, human rights, and religious freedom, all of which make Muslim and Jewish life viable in this country. So, another point of the book was to sort of make clear that with so much at risk here, we simply do not have the luxury to allow the Israel-Palestine issue to tear us apart. Too much is at stake for all of us. So that was kind of the general idea of what we wanted to transmit. But then we sat down. So then when we said, okay, let's go, let's do it. And we turned on a tape recorder. And the first thing I think we did was we identified four principles, four shared principles that are in Judaism and Islam that are we think are at the heart of the Muslim-Jewish connection, of the work that we're doing and these other folks are doing. What are they? We want to tell you briefly. The first one is the precept that I'm not sure everybody in this room would know, which is, if you save one life, it is as though you saved the world. Everybody's shaking their head, yep, we know that one. It's been, it's part of Judaism going back to when you were little kids. Guess what? It's part of Islam too. It's in the Quran, and you know, and it says it in almost the same words, slightly different, but the main thing is that it shows that in both Judaism and Islam we see a commitment to mercy, compassion, and justice, and the preciousness of every single life. And again, the whole thing is that I hadn't known it was in the Quran until I got involved in this work. She hadn't known it was in the Talmud until she got involved in this work, and very few other people. We want to tell people that it's in both. We want people to be aware of that big commonality and many other commonalities in our two faiths. But that's an important one. And the second one is, do I speak this one? Yeah. Welcome the stranger is the second one of our principles. So, and again, both the Torah and the Quran state explicitly the obligation to be kind to the stranger, to welcome him or her, to take them in on the road or when they're passing by your home, you know, and take care of them and treat them like your own. Now, this welcome the stranger for Sabia and I is extremely important personally, because we both of us have mothers who were refugees who came to America. Well, I'm sorry, my mother came to America. My mother fled Nazi Germany to America, and Sabia's mother fled from India to Pakistan. And they both endured, you know, situations where they could have been killed. They could have been, and it's all in the book, so we've decided not to, you know, we hope you're going to read the book and you'll read about those things. But it also, but we carry that forward. We have that in our kind of DNA. But when we see what's going on in this country now, this kind of turning away refugees and turning away people desperately coming to the border, including many Muslim refugees who are trying desperately to get here to save their lives, but they're stymied by bureaucratic indifference and bigotry, and they're demonized as illegals. Guess what? My mother was an illegal when she arrived at Ellis Island. She didn't have the right papers. Hyas took her mother, my grandmother, took her into the city and found a New York City judge who had the same last name, Ringel. And he said, these are my relatives, which I don't think was true. At least, you know, maybe they were distant relatives, but certainly were. And that made it possible for them to stay. So, you know, so my mother was an illegal that she, you know, lived the rest of her life here and gave so much to this country in many ways. So those are very, very important to us. And the third one, okay, Islah and Tikkun Olam. Tikkun Olam, I'm sure you know, and Islah, you know, it means, is Arabic for reform. Tikkun Olam, obviously Hebrew for repairing the world. But they both convey the common moral imperative to help those who are most in need in society. And in this book, we share stories of Jews and Muslims who have worked together side by side to reform and repair our world in many different ways, but a lot of it with social service, feeding the hungry, visiting the sick, and on and on. That's very, very important, and it brings us together.
And the fourth principle that unites us is standing up for each other. And we experienced that as it manifested itself in the aftermath of the 2016 election and the imposition of the travel ban. And I'll read a passage from the book about that. In February 2016, Rabbi Jesse Uletsky and his colleagues marked the Sabbath by getting arrested after they had sat down in the middle of the street in New York City to protest President's anti-Muslim, anti-immigrant, anti-refugee agenda. You can hear me? Okay. That cold Friday evening, Rabbi Litsky and 18 other demonstrators marked the Jewish Sabbath by getting arrested after sitting down in the middle of the street and singing the Song of the Sea, words that the Israelites sang when crossing the parted Red Sea during the Exodus from Egypt, and refused a police order to vacate the street. The rabbi spent the night in jail in a holding cell in New York City's 33rd precinct. Why would a group of rabbis subject themselves to a night in jail to protest a ban on Muslims? Because according to Rabbi Alitsky, we know all too well what happens when one faith doesn't stand up for the other. How could anyone not be moved? Khalid and I felt ready to go to jail for Rabbi Alitsky and his colleagues. And those are the moments when we think about Martin Luther King, who said that only in darkness can you see the stars. And then in 2018, the tables were reversed, and now it was time for the Muslims to stand up for the Jews. Tell us about it, Walter.
Right, so on October 27th, 2018, an event happened which I know all of you remember with horror, the attack on the Tree of Life Synagogue in my hometown of Pittsburgh, and the murder of 11 Jews at prayer by a neo-Nazi. And I just remember myself, getting up that morning and turning on CNN and watching this happen, and I was transfixed and I was horrified. And I said, at that moment, I suddenly had this really weird feeling. Maybe some of you have shared it. Like, for the first time in my life, I don't feel safe as a Jew in America. And of course, since then, we've had other occasions. I think that feeling is there, and it's a very sharp feeling now. But I remember sitting there on the couch, just feeling completely bleak and sort of deeply depressed. And then suddenly, I see on the TV screen that there are men in Muslim dress who are standing around the synagogue holding up placards saying, "We love you, we're there for you, tell us how we can help." And they were from the Islamic Society of Pittsburgh. It turned out the two communities, the two congregations had a relationship, so that was what, that helped to bring them out. So they had been doing some of the same work that Sabi and I and other synagogues and mosques around the country had been doing, the so-called twinning, which I can talk about later. But anyway, there they were, and that was so beautiful. And then after that, a kind of GoFundMe thing started on, online, and within a couple of weeks, within 3 days, I think $200,000+ had been raised by American Muslims across the country for the stricken Tree of Life community. Very powerful. And then finally, at the following Shabbat, there was that come out for Shabbat call, and I'm sure you must have had a powerful event here. I went to a synagogue in Northern Virginia, not far from where I live, which is called Temple Road of Shalom, and the place was just packed with, there was no room in the sanctuary. We were, I came there a little late, so I was in the social hall, and I was cheek to jowl with, it seemed like hundreds and hundreds of people, and many of them around me were Muslim, and it was so amazing. They had come just on call, what's the word? Nobody had said, Muslims come out, they just came. And Christians too, but so many Muslims. And that was incredibly moving to me. And I remember there was one guy who he was standing next to me, and I saw or sitting next to me, and I saw he had his 2 children with him. A little boy about 10 and a little girl maybe a few years younger. And I at one point I reached out to him, so I think I physically hugged him, and I said, "I'm so moved you're here. I can't tell you. But I have a question." I said, "Do you have any concern that this might traumatize your kids to learn about all this and see this?" And he looked at me almost fiercely, and he said, "Never, no. Of course they have to be here. They have to see this. They have to experience this, so they know that when their brothers and sisters are under attack, they need to be there, just as we know that you would be there for us." And that was a really, really powerful moment for me. And I think, it's what Sabia just said now about the light in the darkest moment, that Martin Luther King had said. For me, that was kind of the darkest moment. And it's still, and I think about it, that moment gave me a lot of courage and conviction to continue what we've been doing, the work of Muslim-Jewish relationship building. However, it hasn't been all hearts and flowers. It hasn't been always easy. There have been challenges, of course, And so we're just going to tell you briefly about two of them. One is what we call the two elephants in the room. And the first one, I guess you're probably not going to be totally surprised, is the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. And so this is something we're constantly dealing with, talking about, strategizing. But in the book, we devote a chapter to it. And we've come to believe that the elephant is much too large to just brush under the rug. It's important for Muslims and Jews to build ties of commonalities, a relationship of trust, and then it makes it easier to talk about it. So you can see in the book how Sabiha and I discussed it, but that's just one discussion. But ultimately, we went from, in the early days, we were thinking it's better, let's acknowledge it, but let's say that we're not going to talk about it. We're going to talk about what can we do in Queens to build Muslim-Jewish relations. And that still is the case, but we've realized that we can't just, we really do have to deal with it in one way or another. So that's a work in progress. There is a second elephant, which is the doctrines in our respective holy books that offend the other. And there's many examples of this. But I wanted just to talk very quickly on a personal note that I myself, even though I was working in Muslim-Jewish relations, found myself somewhat offended by how I perceived the Jews were presented in the Quran. Made me uncomfortable. I felt that there was a lot of, when I was reading the Quran in English, there was a lot of kind of shaking the finger at the way I perceived it, and you bad Jews, look, you were chosen, and then you went up, Moses, you came out of Egypt, God brought you out of Egypt, Moses went up on the mountain, came down with the 10 Commandments, and you were out there worshiping the golden calf. What bad people. That's basically how I perceived it. And I said, you know what, I can't just, I need to talk about some of my Muslim friends about this. So I did have conversations with some, regular folks, and Sabiha later on, but I also talked to, several imams, people who were quite learned, and what they said to me, they kind of looked at me with surprise, and they said, but Walter, it says basically the same thing in the Torah, right? And I said, yeah, I mean, the prophets were constantly saying how bad we were, how would we have done that, and then I thought about it, and I said, you know what? So why am I so offended by the Quran, but on the Torah? Well, okay, why? Because it's this human, this is a very important principle in this work, which is that we all, I think all groups, Jews, Muslims, blacks, Hispanics, even whites, I mean, whatever group, it's like they can criticize themselves, they can laugh at themselves, but if anybody else does it, well, it's either anti-Semitism or one of those other isms, because, So anyway, the point of this all was that it was important for me to have those conversations, and I found that's been one of the joys of this work, is that we've been able to have those conversations and come out on the other side like more learned and more together than before.
We also talked about our divergent historical narratives. So Walter questioned me at one time when we were writing this book that what do I think about Prophet Muhammad's relationship with the Jews within the context of what he cited as mass killings of the Jews. I had never heard that. So I did my research and came up with an answer that I thought had settled the matter, or would settle the matter. But then Walter had another follow-up question, and I didn't have the answer to that. So I went back to the books, and now I'm calling up the scholars and emailing them and saying, so what about this? And they are educating me, and then I go back to Walter, and we had this back and forth constantly until I was exhausted. It's all in the chapter titled, Is the Quran Anti-Semitic? Is the Torah Genocidal? By the time we finished writing this chapter, all I could say was, thanks to you, Walter, I am now far better informed. Then Walter raised another question. Your turn.
And this one is, you might think, or some people might think, this question was a little bit esoteric. I call it location, location, location. So take the story, and how that matters to many of us, including me. Take the story in both the Torah and the Quran about Sarah, the matriarch, urging her husband, Abraham, to cast her maidservant Hagar out into the desert with her son Ishmael, who was Abraham's firstborn son, as we know, sending them out into the desert, but then how God showed Hagar a well so they could survive. So, obviously a very important story, but what sort of bugged me was that I found out that, in Islam, this all takes place basically in Mecca. Now, I had lived as a young man in Israel in Beersheba as an Oleh Chadash in 1976. And we used to, and of course it says in the Torah that Abraham was camped near Beersheba in the desert, and I used to go out into the desert and have encounters with Bedouins, and I feel like I'm back in the time of Abraham and all that. And so it was like, it bothered me that in Islam it happened in Mecca. So Sabia and I had a candid conversation in the book as to how each perceives what happened and why geography matters, which led us to a discussion of the larger conflict of Sarah and Hagar.
So what Walter said to me was that, Sabia, if I was a Muslim, I would be very upset at Sarah for having thrown Hagar and Ishmael out of the house, and they ended up in the desert. And I said, Walter, that's not our narrative. We don't believe that Sarah had anything to do with it. We believe that Abraham took them into the desert and left them there because it was God's command. And we believe that when he took them there and left them and turned back to go, Hagar called out to Abraham and said, "Are you leaving us here because God asked you to?" And he said, "Yes." And she said, "Then he will provide for us." So we don't hold it against Sarah at all. In fact, we revere her. We name our daughters Sarah. And when my husband and I went to the tomb of the patriarchs, we said our Fatiha, the prayer, over Sarah's burial place. So we don't have a problem with this. And maybe then you and I can put this conflict of Sarah and Hagar to rest and drink to that, non-alcoholic for me. We have, in this dialogue and in this exercise, learned, and through our experiences, learned some lessons that we would like to share with you. The first is that we are Americans first. And whereas the Palestinian-Israeli conflict matters deeply to us, we live here, not there. And unless Muslims and Jews come together, we stand at risk of an existential threat. What happened on January 6th was the prologue, as we know now, of the worst things to come, like voter suppression. And if democracy is threatened, the communities that are most at threat will be the minority faith communities and other ethnic minorities, particularly Muslims and Jews. We need to come together. Walter, pick up on the next few.
Sure. The second one is speak out and stay engaged together as Muslims and Jews against injustice both at home and abroad. So if we stick up for the principles of democracy and human rights here at home, we should be able to do it also around the world and take positions in favor, for example, on situations in India or Myanmar, the brutalization of the Rohingyas, what the Chinese have done to the Uyghurs, and also in injustices and repressions in Saudi Arabia, Egypt, and in Israel and Palestine. So we see whether we can do that together, and we try to stand together on some of those points. The third one, and now we come back to the Israel-Palestine conflict, is that we believe that Jews and Muslims together here, American Muslims and Jews, should support the work of NGOs in Israel and Palestine that are working to improve conditions on the ground and save lives. And I'll say very briefly that I've been involved in something called Project Rosanna, which is an NGO to bring Israelis and Palestinians together through healthcare and the provision of healthcare, and does incredible work, for example, in just one of many programs, bringing Palestinian children who are sick with cancers and or need kidney dialysis, which is not available in Palestinian hospitals mostly, to get them to hospitals across the checkpoints into Jerusalem, to Hadassah, to other hospitals. And we use volunteer drivers, Palestinian volunteer drivers, who bring them to the checkpoints from inside of Palestine, and then Israeli drivers. So that's one example. It's that's a very important thing, because otherwise it would cost thousands of dollars. They wouldn't be able to, that's really saving a life to provide that kind of thing. So that kind of thing I think is really, really, really important, because one thing it allows us to do is that normally we look at the Israel-Palestine conflict and we say, oh my God, this is a problem. We don't want to talk about it. It's going to drive us apart, or if we do talk about it, we're going to end up yelling at each other. But with doing this together, saving lives and supporting Israelis and Palestinians who are saving lives and building bridges, we're doing that together, and it's very, very, very meaningful and very powerful, and gives us some skin in the game over there as well. And finally, two more that I'll tell you about. One is that I think we need to allow others to speak out if we agree with them or not. And here I'm thinking, as a Jew, that many in our community, including me, have been bothered by comments made by Ilhan Omar or Rashida Tlaib, Muslim members of Congress over the last few years. And, we can talk about kind of what they said, but my thought is that what they're doing, in a sense, is they are passionately, supportive of Palestine, in the same way that many Jewish representatives, obviously, many more Jewish representatives in Congress and in the Senate, support Israel. And so if we need to make room at the table, in a sense, for others to take their positions. And finally, we should not allow, and this is very important, we should not allow Israel-Palestine to be weaponized in ways that drive our communities apart. And, I've seen that happen in many ways. I think that one where we're seeing it now is the issue of anti-Semitism, which is extremely important. But I think there are some definitions, for example, that are being used to say that, put people in the position that if anybody says a word of criticism of Israel, that they're likely anti-Semitic. And I think that's very problematic. I saw an example of that just recently in Washington, which I can talk to you about. But those kind of things, we need to keep lines of communication open. We need to sometimes hear things. In other words, some of us are willing to hear criticism of Israel from Jews, but if non-Jews do it, as I said before, then it's anti-Semitic. Not necessarily the case. And some people, some non-Jews, some Christians and Muslims who I've worked very closely with, fear, in a sense, that if they are outspoken at all on Israel issues, that they'll be called anti-Semitic. And I know with many of them, they certainly are not anti-Semitic. So those are...
And three more points. Yeah. Let's not denigrate or demonize people on either side. Activists like Linda Sarsour correctly demand that they be able to speak freely as proud Palestinian Americans, but we disagree when Zionists are demonized. Muslims should engage with mainstream American Jews who consider themselves Zionists rather than allying themselves exclusively with fringe groups. Jews should engage with Muslims like Tlaib, Omar, and Sarsour, even if we don't agree on the Middle East issues, because we do agree on many causes like hunger, like free speech, that are important to both communities, where we can work together despite our differences on other issues. And finally, let's be cautious about labeling one another as anti-Semitic or Islamophobic. Criticizing Israel's leaders and policies is just that, a criticism of the leaders and their policies. It is not a criticism of all Jews. And similarly, criticizing Muslim leaders of Muslim countries is exactly that. It's not Islamophobia. Having said that, we still need to be sensitive to the sensibilities on either side so that our statements are not misconstrued as being either anti-Semitic or Islamophobic, particularly if they were not meant to be as such. So with that, we will close our formal presentation and open it up for questions and answers from you. And thank you so much for listening, and we hope that you will be interested in reading more about what we had to say in our book. You didn't want to read anything, did you?
Well, I
Okay.
got lost.
All right.
Oh, sorry. Yes.
Anyone has a question at all? Okay. Let me get to you.
Okay. I'm going to pick up on what you just said, Sabiha, because, and I'm going to pick up on the Linda Sassoon issue, Sassoon, and I'm going to confess right now that I'm not up to speed on this and have basically a vague memory of reading her comments and reading comments made by the Congresswoman, by AOC, by others that are offensive, that weren't principled, and that were classically anti-Semitic. And it seems to me, I mean, I felt very strongly, and continue to feel very strongly, that we, people of good faith and shared values and commonality, have an obligation to speak out and to call out the Linda Sassoons of this world. And while we can make common cause with them and understand where they're coming, at the same point, it's critically important to call them out on it. I guess I'd like to hear your thoughts on that.
Yeah, you're right. I agree with you that it goes both ways. And whereas Linda Sarsour has also been at the forefront of doing the fundraising after the Tree of Life Synagogue and been very active in the Women's March. She was amongst the leaders. She has been in the forefront in support of American Jews. But she does have a point of view on Israel. She has to be allowed to speak out and speak her voice, but when and if it crosses the lines where it hurts the sensibilities of the Jewish people, as being felt that it's anti-Semitic, yes, it definitely should be called out. Walter?
Yeah, I wanted to say that I think the two of us, and I know I did in a piece I wrote, did call her out when she said, "You can't be a Zionist and a feminist." That may be the one you remember. You don't remember that one? That in other words, right. And that was, I think, the one that, really felt crossed the line. Because, look, I mean, first of all, many of the founding mothers of feminism were Jewish, as we all know. Betty Friedan, Gloria Steinem, on and on and on. So, and again, from my perspective, one of the problems that we see with her and some in the Muslim community is the sense that we will not talk to any Zionists, but we will talk to Jewish anti-Zionists. And obviously the problem with that is that's maybe less than 10% of our community, right? Even if you include the Satmar Hasidim as part of that, but it's a very small. I mean, that most of us love Israel, and we, some of us are critical of Israel, and I'm quite concerned about what's going on right now in Israel. But we're not going to allow Israel to be demonized. And so when it's both problematic, as a statement of fact, but it also kind of rules out. I mean, it rules out the kind of work we're trying to do, And so we have taken her on that. But we do agree. I agree with Sabiha, though, that she has a perspective that we need to not just say, oh, well, that's automatically anti-Semitic. We can't, she's our enemy, et cetera, because because Muslim-Jewish relations, again, we have the fraud issue of Israel-Palestine, which is there, and the challenge is if we can, on sometimes agree to disagree, while respecting each other, while understanding the imperative to build relations here. It's a constant struggle and not easy, but I think we feel, the two of us feel that the two sides need to hear each other and not just immediately go, whoop, we're closing communication.
Any other question? Yes.
Hello. Speaking about Linda Sarsour and AOC, et cetera, when we speak of allies, think of the allies that we have around the world, like France, for instance, okay, or Germany. Do we always agree on everything? In fact, the French are just coming closer to the United States right now, from what I understand, in our relations with one another. So when we have allies, they're not necessarily, and even partners, okay, we disagree on some things. Linda Sarsour wrote, and I think it was a letter to the editor just last week or so, on anti-Semitism that was phenomenal. Any rabbi would have written it. So she might have, I know Jews, in fact, I know some rabbis who have been called anti-Semitic by other Jews and other rabbis, okay, because they disagree with the government. Linda Sarsour, I do believe, from what I know of her, and I've not met her personally, but I've communicated with her, is doing what you suggested. She opposes a particular government policy, but not necessarily not opposing Jews. She makes that distinction. And sometimes one does go overboard when one is speaking. The other thing is, what you're doing now, bringing people together where we can meet one another and know one another, and you and I and Khalid, I had a wonderful time spending 3 weeks with you, 3 meetings with you, I think, at the Common Point Y in a discussion, and that was just wonderful, and I learned a great deal. Just give one more example. Sometimes our politicians who are not Jewish don't really know Jews very well, okay? They're not in touch with us. Even AOC, for instance, hardly had any connection with Jewish people. My daughter, who was a rabbi, spent some time trying to convince her, who lives in her community, she is represented by AOC, had AOC come to her home, have dinner with her, and half a dozen other Jewish leaders in the neighborhood of Jackson Heights, okay? And in the process of talking with one another, they got to know one another better and maybe understood one another's positions better. So, I guess what I'm trying to say is just because you're an ally doesn't mean you agree on everything. And if you want to have allies, you have to meet with them.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you for sharing that.
Yes, Neil?
I'd like to follow up on what you were kind of speaking about, knowing people. So I'm a principal in a school for many years, and I have a great staff, and this woman very comfortably says to me, when I came up from the South, I never knew any Jews, and school was closed on the Jewish holidays. I said, well, probably it was the lawyers who said there were so many Jewish teachers at the time in the city who were taking these holidays off. They were afraid there was going to be, who knows, there wasn't anybody in the schools. And to be honest with you, you're a union member. Your union's not giving up a holiday. And everybody laughed and said, pretty good explanation. New York City and some of the schools in Long Island, and now some in Westchester, are beginning to take 2 holidays off. And I have to tell you that I think Jewish kids will enjoy having the day off, but they'll learn a little bit more about a religion that they never knew about. Just like this woman said to me, I didn't know anything about it. So, that, that's the generation. We want the next generation to be better than ours. And I do have to comment that between my son and my daughter and the different religions that they dated, I had to buy the book, Religion for Dummies, because I never knew what was going on.
Wow.
Thank you.
May I quickly share a story along the same lines? It was Hanukkah, and our sisterhood had a meeting, and our Jewish sisters were telling the story of Hanukkah. So I picked up a couple of latkes and those chocolates wrapped in gold coin, because my granddaughter, who was 5 at the time, was coming the next day to spend the day with me, and I thought I'd give her an education in Jewish traditions. So she comes and she sits down at the table, and I'm all ready to, go into my discourse, and I put the latkes on the table, and she says, "Oh, latkes, my friend Stephanie has them because it's Hanukkah." Okay. Oh, maybe she doesn't know about this. So I go running and I bring out that, what I thought was chocolate wrapped in gold paper, and I said, "Asha, do you know what this is? This is a piece of chocolate that looks like a coin." And she looks to me and she says, "Dadi, it's a gelt." Gelt, right? Right?
Gelt. G-E-L-T.
Yeah, yeah. So I had never heard that word, and I went running to Google, and my husband says, "What are you doing?" I said, "I think this kid knows what she's talking about. G-E-L-T. What is gelt? Oh my God, it's a chocolate wrapped in coin." So that's what these special holidays are doing. They are educating our children. I mean, I didn't. Thanks for that.
I had a question. Walter, the work you do in your organization, does that involve getting people together to discuss conferences or what, to encourage the interfaith conversation?
Sure. Well, maybe I would say is that I started doing this work in bringing together Muslims and Jews back in 2008 when I went to work for the foundation, and they gave me this nice title, Muslim-Jewish director, and program director, and I suddenly realized, I started looking online, I realized I was probably the only one in the world, so the question was, what was I supposed to do, what was the job? And so together with the Rabbi Schneier, who was my boss, we decided, he said his idea was that we should hold an event once a year called the Weekend of Twinning, and we should try to link up synagogues and mosques one-on-one in different cities across America to, on that particular weekend, to hold events together. So that, so that first year we were able to get 50 mosques and 50 synagogues, which was much more than we expected, and we were able to build it up from there. And then we began doing this work in other countries too, in Europe especially, and Canada and other countries. So what did that involve? And usually, and what does it involve even today when we do events in my group in Washington? So it really varies widely because, as I look nationally, we had suggested we could have, discussions about, our, commonalities in our faiths, and we could do holiday celebrations together. And the other one that was big was social service, going out and especially feeding the hungry together, which was, very, very powerful. And also, have frank conversations about, our differences, but also why it's important for us to work together. So we did, it was kind of across the board, and it continues to be that way.
Does it get into the political realm at all? Is it some kind of outreach?
Well, for example, yeah, we're going to be doing an event in Washington in February. It's called this group, Jews and Muslims and Allies Acting Together, where we're going to be talking about, the main focus is going to be the danger to Jews, Muslims, and Christians and others from something called Christian nationalism, which is becoming a real thing in this country, which is usually white Christian nationalism, which is, coming from the far right, but also much of some of the evangelical movement is invested in this. So we'll be talking about that, but we'll also be saying, well, look, this is not only happening in America. I mean, we have in India, we have the Hindu nationalism has become a huge thing with the government, and there's a lot of persecution of Muslims. In Muslim countries, such as Iran, obviously, the very extreme repressive nationalism and abuse of their own citizens, or in Saudi Arabia as well. And in Israel now, we have the issues with what's coming in the last election of people who were supporters of Meir Kahane and are what one would have to call Jewish supremacists, really, so that they just got a big vote, and they're going to be a big part of the next coalition, and that's very frightening. So we're acknowledging all of that, and talking about all of that, so try to see this thing in a kind of global context. But, the main focus will be what can we do here, here in America, where both of our, Muslims and Jews and others, people, diverse groups, and people who believe in diversity and pluralism and democracy feel under threat from this. And so that's one where, yeah, we are going into politics.
Thank you. Okay, no more questions?
What's your sense of the most effective way to address the Kylie Irvings and the Yees and the Nick Fuentes of this world, who seem to be getting a lot of traction?
Yeah, they're getting a lot of traction because bad news makes news, and then it takes on a life of its own, and that's what they're counting on. We see that with many of our political leaders who will say anything to, control the narrative. And I mean, from our perspective, we've spoken up. I mean, we've taken to social media, and which can be pretty powerful in calling them out, and writing about it, talking about it.
I would add something else, which all very true what Sabia just said. I think that the issue now with anti-Semitism, there are a couple of things that are going on that are very important. One is that there is this upsurge of anti-Semitism, which is really scary and it's really genuine, and I think it's mainly coming from the far right and the neo-nationalists and even neo-Nazis, and that is really, really scary. But I think it would be a mistake for Jews to pull in and say, oh, the whole world hates us, and we don't have any allies, and we need to just talk about anti-Semitism as though there wasn't also an issue of issues of racism or Islamophobia or anti-gay bigotry coming from the same kinds of people. And here's one where so let me just tell you this story, which is that in Montgomery County, Maryland, where I live next to it, just outside of Washington, the Jewish Community Relations Council and I think American Jewish Committee and ADL and were pushing very hard and ultimately succeeded to get the county council to support a resolution against anti-Semitism, but which said that we have to use going forward the gold standard of defining anti-Semitism, which is something that's put out by something called the International Holocaust Remembrance Association, IHRA. I forget what the A is. Alliance, I'm sorry. International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance. Anyway, they have a particular definition of anti-Semitism, which I find a little bit troubling. The definition itself is 2 sentences long, and it talks about, acts of bigotry or violence against Jews or incitement is fine. But then they have a group of examples down below and said these two could be anti-Semitism, or probably are. And they insist that the examples be used together with the definition. And several of the examples are if people first of all, if they deny the right of Israel to exist, that's anti-Semitic. That one I'm ready to say, okay, there's another one that says that if you criticize Israel more than you criticize other democratic countries, well, then that's probably anti-Semitism. And that I do have a problem with because, as I said, the issue of criticism of Israel, of equating the criticism of Israel with anti-Semitism, I think is very dangerous because I've dealt with Christian and Muslim leaders, people I know of goodwill, people I trust, who say, you know what, I feel when they're pushing this definition that essentially they're sort of, it's kind of like a threat. Like if you say if you say anything that's critical of the actions of Israel, you may be called anti-Semitic, which is not a great thing to be called, right? And so they were very, many of these people, and people in the Jewish community as well, many rabbis were opposed to this resolution, but it did pass because no politician at election time wants to be called an anti-Semite. So the question is, what are we really trying to achieve? Do we want to build alliances? Do we, there is a way, again, there is a wave of anti-Semitism, and it's deeply, deeply concerning. But do we want to face it alone, or do we want to see it as part of a larger wave of bigotry, and build alliances with people who we could stand together with? So that's how I feel about it.
I think that I just want to add to what has been said. The subtitle of the book is One Friendship at a Time. So we are fortunate that we live in New York City, which is much easier to communicate with and moderates of all kinds. It's harder, I think, in the heart of the country to get this kind of message out. But even here, for many years, we have had an interfaith book club in which we share stories or fiction or whatever of different faiths. So one of our friends, who's been now with us for 10 years, we were together one day, and she was talking to her sister on the phone, and she said, oh, I'll call you back, I'm having a lunch with my friends. So it was just an ordinary sentence, but I turned to Sabia, I said, 10 years ago, she would have said, I'm having lunch with some Muslim New Yorkers or Muslim friends. Now we had gone past that label and we were friends. So I think that meeting each other, we are no longer others. So I think if we keep doing that, like you have invited us and we are here, and if we keep meeting each other and sharing bread or a cup of coffee with each other, we will be no longer others. We will still have differences and we will still challenge each other, but I think that fear of other and all that goes away. So one friendship at a time. Yeah.
Oh, okay, Susan.
Hi, thank you for the presentation. It's been very interesting, and I like your format of demonstrating or setting the example of camaraderie as that being the standard. And I also think like there's also so much talk in the college campuses about, how could I say, covert abuses or even stronger than that, and there's so much division in the college institution. I think that would be, and certainly reading is very important in the college communities. I think it would be great just to, how could I say, spread your example of camaraderie and getting along rather than, they hear their politicians and they've been brought up to, how could I say, listen to them, though they don't deeply understand it, and they with a gut reaction, they turn to, how could I say, the feelings that they've been brought up at home. So if you could, how could I say, detone that, at the college level, I think that would be, A, something that's a problem in thing, and B, you're going to reach a huge, amount of people who could detone and set the example in their future homes and things like that. Just a thought,
Yeah, thank you for that suggestion. It all starts with the youth. Actually, it starts in the home around the dinner table, the kind of conversations that mom and dad are having and what the children are listening to and what happens on the playgrounds and in primary school, but definitely college campuses. Walter and I have done quite a number of talks at academic institutions but we do need to do more. So if any of you have linkages with academic institutions, please help us make a connection, and we would like very much to keep expanding our reach. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your wonderful presentation. We're going to have some refreshments next door in the ballroom, and our presenters are going to sign their books if you care to be interested in that.
Oh, yes, and we accept cash, credit cards, check, bitcoins, Zelle, PayPal, Venmo, crypto.